This is an interview on domestic abuse, and we have a list of questions, and we have our lovely assistant.
Rochelle from the student engagement team. I'm a student engagement / safeguarding officer.
Okay. All right. Let's get to it. All right. The first question is is there any way that you could possibly spot the victim of domestic abuse just from, let's say, if you were just out wandering about or anything like that?
Okay, in college or outside or both?
Both.
Both. Okay, so in college, it's very. Let me just say, it's very difficult to spot domestic abuse because the victims tend to hide what's going on, and they tend to do that quite well. So unless you was to physically see an argument between the two individuals, and even then you still might think, well, it could just be some volatile incident, you don't know what's happened, so you might not think to get involved. So I don't think generally, without seeing maybe bruises or without noticing, or it'll only be if you really know the individual.
Okay.
And you could see the changes in them when they get into a domestic relationship. That's really the way you're going to be tell. If you're talking about strangers that you have no contact with, then you wouldn't be able to tell. But amongst your friends, because it's quite common amongst young people now, so amongst your friends, you might be able to spot signs, like they may stop coming out, they may change what they're wearing, they may constantly not be in contact with you when they're with the other partner, or they may say that, oh, my partner's got my passwords, or things like that to you might not seem quite normal.
Okay.
But it's very difficult. It's not something you can just pick up straight away.
Going on from that, in the case of if you do witness some domestic abuse, and you see bruises or you actually see a fight or an argument, who would be the person to instigate the help? Would the victim have to come to you, or would you in that case go to the victim and ask them?
Two ways really. Like if I was to see it on the street, then there definitely would be a case of contacting the police.
Okay.
Because what you find with domestic abuse, because it's so manipulative, the females or the males that are the victims are not actually going to want to seek support generally. They will feel like they are portraying their partner, they will feel like they shouldn't be doing it, or they might make excuses for it. So I would suggest in that case, if it was a friend, I would advise your friend, be there for your friend, keep in contact and try and support them as much as possible, but constantly advise them to go and speak to someone. If it's a case of they are at risk at the time, immediate risk, I would contact the police on their behalf, because it's very unlikely that they're going to do that themselves.
Okay, that's moving on to a question further down the list.
Yeah.
Have you ever come across a situation where the person you were trying to help has been hostile towards you guys before, or any authoritative figure trying to help them?
Not me personally, but I know, because we have dealt with domestic violence in college, there are students that have actually experienced that. And they're not necessarily hostile, but they don't really want to follow up with things. So if you suggest, oh, you need to have a meeting with a lady from Women's Aid, for example, unless they're in a position where they actually understand the scale of the danger they're in, a lot of the times they might miss appointments, they might not, if you say to them, come and meet me at this time, they might not turn up. Or so what you find is, if they're not in a position where they want help, they will come to you initially, but then they won't follow up and follow through. And then what they will do is they might not be in contact with you, and then in between that time they might get back with the partner as well. So not necessarily hostile, because generally the victims know that what's happening isn't right somewhere within them, but they might just be a bit reluctant or a bit scared to follow through with services.
Okay, all right. in the case of like, so far, like I've heard there's a lot of support for the victims, but in the case of an abuser, what would happen to them?
It all depends really. I do agree that there's not a lot of support for perpetrators of abuse. I do agree that there needs to be more support, but what you tend to find is the abuser doesn't actually acknowledge or want to acknowledge that they are being abusive. So they, in their mind, it's the other person's fault. There's always a reason why it's their fault. It's not their fault. They generally don't take responsibility for it. But I think that if there was more support for them, then the ones that may eventually get to that point where they're like, actually, like, I need to take responsibility for this, they would have a service available for them. So I do think it's needed, but at the same time, there are services like within the UK that do support and online services and things like that, but generally the perpetrators don't access that support.
Because they just don't see what they're doing.
They don't see it.
Some abusers might be on like low self-esteem, and that can impact on like.
Definitely. I definitely think that perpetrators have their own issues, and rather than dealing with them, they kind of mask them and offload it onto the victim. So I do think, and I generally think, because obviously in domestic violence, majority of the cases are against females. It does happen to males, however, it's not a case of it's only females, but generally males, there's a lack of support for males generally anyway. I think that males need a bit more support. I think from back in the day, males generally didn't acknowledge emotions and they just kind of got on with it, and that's how we've come to a place where people think, well, men don't need it because they're fine, you know. And men, even if you had the support, sometimes men feel that it would be weak for them to actually access that. But I think we're at a time now where I think males are more open to emotions, and they're more aware of different mental health issues, so they will come and approach that support. And I think if we had more support services, especially at early intervention, then it would lead to less domestic violence.
Okay, that's good to know. Have you, in cases where the person or a victim has gone through the cycle and they've actually ended the relationship, they've become a survivor of domestic abuse, have you seen any signs of them, like, possibly relapsing, and like they still kind of have like a little bit of feeling towards their abuser?
Of course. It's domestic is so crazy. Like with domestic violence, it's amazing how much manipulation, control, and feelings can have power over somebody. Because if you was to take a stranger and say, this stranger, you don't know from no one, he's going to come and beat you up every day, you wouldn't have that. You would be like, what? No, I'm not going to take that. But with domestic violence, they will continually go back and they will feel that it is their fault, and they will feel that they've done something wrong, and they will feel like maybe if I did this or I did that things would change, and they always have that kind of hope. I've had one case where it's been since September this year. Initially, this student came to me and said, I don't know if I am in an abusive relationship. And then it was explained what was going on in the relationship. And I said, no, you're definitely in an abusive relationship. And that's gone on since September. In between then, they have broken up, got back together, broken up, got back together. But it's got to the stage where indecent images of that person was sent to a family member. Threats to kill have been made, things like that. There's been violence, there's been arguments, there's constant kind of putting down, you look like this, you're this, you're that, you're this or that. And in between all that, they've got back together. And what I noticed is when they were back together, the student, she would stop coming to see me. And that's how you know that something's not right. She's not coming in, things. So, But now, thank God the relationship is over, and she seeked the support that she needed. But now you see a completely change in her. You know, you see that she's got life in her. It can be very draining being part of domestic violence, because your whole being is for that other person. So when you wake up in the morning, you're deciding what to wear. You're not thinking on your own what you should wear. You're thinking what you think your partner would want you to wear. And then on your way to college, if a guy says hello to you, you're not thinking, I want to say hello to that guy. You're worried, thinking, oh my God, what would my partner say if he knew that I said hello to this guy? And then in college with your friends, like, oh, am I talking too much to this guy? Or, oh, I don't want to be friends with this girl. I don't want to get too close to my friends, because if I start telling them about what's going on, he's not going to like it. So it affects literally every stage of a person's life. It's not just like, oh, when they're there and when they're arguing, that's what happens. It's constantly in their head. And then if they're constantly being put down by that person as well, when they're feeling quite low, all those thoughts will come back and they will replay.
Okay. Yeah. When you were going on about how like the relationship was ending and then restarting again, and there was like threats of death and so on and so forth made, in what instance would the police get involved? Like, what would merit the police getting involved in a situation like that?
Well, straight away, really, especially threats when it's with, like, in that instance, when there was initially threats to send out indecent images, and at that instance, that's when the police were involved, because obviously the victim's worried, like, oh my God, this is going to get sent out, everyone's going to see it. They don't know what to do about it. Obviously, not everyone has power. No one really has powers to stop things like that. So in that instance, the police were called. But then that person didn't want to make a statement, and they didn't want to take it any further. So then the police, this is where the police have a difficult time as well. So they couldn't do nothing much with it. And then afterwards, it came back again when the images were actually sent this time, and then there were threats to kill. The police got involved again, but the perpetrator actually filed a complaint against the victim, saying that she was harassing him. So I'm not sure the outcome, because that's kind of still ongoing. I'm not really sure what's happened since then, but I know at the moment they are not together. She is a lot happier, and we just hope that it stays that way. But at the first instance, basically services should be involved, but it takes a while for the victim to realise that they're in a domestic. They might make excuses for it, or they may deny it, and it's at that point where they're like, I need help. This usually gets to quite, I think it's like what. They say there's a statistic that a victim will, if it's a violent thing, they will get hit like 30, 40 times before they even go to the police initially. So it's quite difficult for the victims to get services involved, but they should be involved straight away. But it's sometimes difficult to pick up what's abusive and what's actually, it was just an argument, and yeah, I did do that wrong, and I'll try again next time. Okay. It's really hard.
Would you say that there is a definite need for more education on what a domestic abuse relationship is?
I think so. I'm not sure about education in schools at the moment and how that all pans out and how deep it goes, because I think it's with education, it's like, if it's not done the right way, it's just going to go over people's heads. And then at the same time, if it's done too young, you can't even comprehend it, because a lot of people haven't even been in a relationship in school, so they don't even know, like, it's still kind of like, oh, we hold hands or we ignore each other across the playground, but we're a couple. It's kind of that stuff. So I think definitely for college and universities, it's crucial that it needs to be like, well, maybe not unis because they don't really have tutorials and stuff, but definitely in colleges I think it's useful. But then you find that with things like this, if it hasn't happened to you or you don't know anyone it's happened to, you can't, it doesn't seem real. It seems like, you know, the films, you see it on a film and it's just there, but it doesn't really affect you. So I think it does need to be done at the right age and in the right way, and it needs to be like, it needs to be able to, young people need to understand that these things happen. And when you hear things like, oh, one in 3, 2 women a week are killed by domestic violence, for you, you're like, okay, that's fine. But when you're hearing like 1 in 6 men are affected as well, and you look at a classroom, there's at least 6 boys in there, at least one of them is likely, like very likely, and will go through some element of domestic abuse. But when you're talking to students about that, it's difficult for them to kind of match it up, because they're like, well, that's not going to happen to me, because they think that, you know, someone's going to walk up to you and have an abuser tag on their head and you're going to know straight away. You won't know until it's too late, and by that time it's whether you have the strength to get that support or not.
Okay. All right, well, that's everything covered.
Oh, cool.
Thank you very much for your time.
No worries. If you'd like, I don't know, anything else, if you have any other stuff, say if stuff we can help you with, like, come down. We enjoy doing this. We are doing healthy relationships tutorials as well next month.
Okay.
So if and even if you guys are more interested in knowing stuff about it yourself or anything like that, please do come and speak to us, because